The Fort Harrison Officers Club falls into stunned silence as a man in civilian clothes rises from his corner table, flanked by aides carrying official military documentation and briefing folders. Major Derek Stevens' confident smirk vanishes as he recognizes the black man he'd just humiliated and dismissed as some lost enlisted guy who doesn't belong in the officers' area 5 minutes earlier. "Good evening, officers," Colonel Marcus Freeman announces, his voice carrying unmistakable command authority throughout the dining room. "I'm Colonel Marcus Freeman, your new base commander. Some of you may not recognize me without my dress uniform, as I've been conducting an informal assessment of base culture and leadership standards." His eyes lock onto Stevens, who's gone pale. "Major Stevens, I believe we need to discuss why you told me to find the enlisted club where people like me belong, suggested I was probably lost and looking for kitchen duty, and informed other officers that you were handling a situation with someone who clearly doesn't understand military hierarchy." The gathered officers freeze in recognition. The major who 30 seconds ago had treated him like an inferior subordinate now faces the colonel who will determine his military career. And that career is about to face a reckoning under new command. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 hours earlier, Colonel Marcus Freeman had arrived at Fort Harrison Army Base for what would be the most challenging command assignment of his 22-year military career. At 44, Freeman had built his reputation on transforming underperforming units through principled leadership, tactical excellence, and unwavering commitment to the Army values that prioritize duty, respect, and integrity above personal comfort or institutional convenience. His appointment as base commander represented both recognition of his exceptional service record and acknowledgement that Fort Harrison needed comprehensive reform following a series of incidents that had damaged the installation's reputation and operational effectiveness. Freeman's background was exemplary by any measure. West Point graduate, 2 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, multiple commendations for leadership under fire, and a doctorate in organizational psychology that informed his approach to military leadership and institutional change. His previous assignment had been rescuing the 82nd Airborne's training program after a scandal involving discriminatory practices that had undermined unit cohesion and mission readiness. But Fort Harrison presented unique challenges that went beyond typical military leadership problems. The base had been plagued by complaints about racial discrimination, sexual harassment, and toxic leadership that created hostile environments for female soldiers and minorities while protecting incompetent officers whose failures endangered mission success and troop welfare. The previous commander, Colonel William Henderson, had been quietly reassigned after an investigation revealed that his leadership style prioritized personal loyalty over professional competence, resulting in promotion of officers who reflected his prejudices rather than Army standards. His departure had created opportunity for comprehensive reform, but also resistance from entrenched interests who viewed change as threat to their privileged positions. Major Derek Stevens exemplified the institutional problems Freeman had been sent to address. At 38, Stevens had spent 12 years at Fort Harrison, rising through supply division ranks, not through exceptional performance, but through political skill and demographic advantage that insulated him from accountability for mediocre results and questionable judgment. Stevens' personnel file revealed concerning patterns that previous leadership had ignored. Multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment of subordinates, particularly female soldiers and minorities, performance evaluations that consistently overrated his achievements while overlooking failures, and documented instances of undermining superior officers whose leadership styles conflicted with his personal preferences. What made Stevens particularly problematic was his influence among a cohort of mid-level officers who shared his resistance to diversity initiatives and inclusive leadership practices. This informal network had created parallel power structure that operated according to old boy preferences rather than official Army policies, making institutional change difficult to implement and sustain. Freeman's appointment had been announced 3 weeks earlier through official channels, but he had deliberately delayed his formal arrival to conduct preliminary assessment of base culture and leadership dynamics. His experience with organizational transformation had taught him that understanding institutional problems required observing how personnel behaved when they thought authority figures weren't watching. The Officers Club represented perfect opportunity for such assessment. An environment where officers relaxed their professional facades and revealed attitudes that might be concealed during formal interactions. Freeman's decision to enter in civilian clothes rather than uniform was calculated to observe authentic behavior rather than performative compliance. What he hadn't anticipated was that his preliminary assessment would expose racism so blatant and institutionalized that it demanded immediate intervention rather than gradual reform. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Palmer, Freeman's designated executive officer, had been briefing him throughout the transition process about Fort Harrison's cultural challenges and resistance to change that previous reform efforts had encountered. "Sir, there's an informal network of mid-level officers who've been here for years and view any change as personal attack on their authority," Palmer had warned during their preliminary meeting. "They're skilled at appearing compliant while undermining new policies through passive resistance and selective enforcement." Her assessment would prove prophetic. Stevens represented exactly the type of entrenched resistance that made military reform challenging even when top leadership was committed to change. Brigadier General William Hayes, Freeman's superior at division level, had personally selected him for the Fort Harrison assignment based on his track record of successful institutional transformation without destroying unit morale or operational effectiveness. "Marcus, I need someone who can clean house without burning it down," Hayes had explained during Freeman's assignment briefing. "Fort Harrison has good soldiers and officers who've been let down by toxic leadership. Your job is to remove the cancer while preserving what's worth saving." The medical metaphor was apt. Institutional racism and toxic leadership function like diseases that spread through organizational systems, requiring surgical precision to remove without damaging healthy tissue. Freeman's approach emphasized leading by example rather than relying solely on positional authority. His philosophy was that authentic change required demonstrating values through personal behavior rather than simply mandating compliance through regulation and punishment. As Freeman had driven onto Fort Harrison that afternoon, reviewing intelligence about personnel, operations, and institutional culture, he had been mentally preparing for months of careful relationship building, strategic patience, and gradual culture change. What he was about to discover was that some problems required immediate, decisive action rather than diplomatic gradualism, and that Major Stevens' institutional racism was so flagrant that it provided perfect opportunity to establish new command standards through dramatic accountability rather than subtle influence. The officer who thought his 12 years of protected mediocrity made him untouchable was about to discover that new leadership meant new standards, and that his assumptions about racial hierarchy in the military were about to collide with the reality of merit-based command authority. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Freeman entered the Fort Harrison Officers Club at 1800 hours wearing khakis and a polo shirt, his civilian attire designed to allow observation of authentic officer behavior rather than the formal courtesy that uniforms commanded. The club's dining room was filled with about 30 officers enjoying dinner and informal networking that built relationships crucial for unit cohesion and mission effectiveness. Freeman chose a corner table that provided clear sight lines to observe interactions while remaining relatively inconspicuous. His 22 years of military experience had taught him that institutional culture was most visible during off-duty social environments where professional facades relaxed and authentic attitudes emerged. Major Derek Stevens sat at a prominent table with 5 other mid-level officers, his body language and voice volume suggesting he considered himself the center of attention and authority. Freeman recognized the type immediately: officers who confused seniority with leadership and mistook loudness for competence. Stevens was holding forth about maintaining standards and ensuring proper respect for military hierarchy, in terms that Freeman recognized as coded language for resistance to diversity initiatives and inclusive leadership practices that have been Army policy for over a decade. The problem with this new generation of soldiers is they don't understand respect for authority, Stevens declared to his table mates. Too much sensitivity training, not enough focus on discipline and knowing your place in the chain of command. His commentary revealed the mindset that Freeman had been sent to change, viewing equality as threat to authority rather than foundation for effective leadership. Freeman was reviewing base personnel files on his tablet when Stevens noticed him, the major's expression immediately shifting to suspicion and territorial concern about an unfamiliar black man in the officers' dining area. Stevens approached Freeman's table with the aggressive confidence that characterized his interactions with anyone he perceived as challenging his authority or position. "Excuse me, I don't think we've met. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The question was phrased as polite inquiry, but carried clear implication that Freeman didn't belong in officers' quarters. Stevens' tone and body language communicated skepticism about Freeman's right to be present rather than welcoming curiosity about a new colleague. Freeman looked up from his tablet with calm professionalism. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Major. Thank you for your concern." His response was courteous but firm, neither deferential nor confrontational. The measured tone that effective leaders use to de-escalate potential conflicts while maintaining appropriate dignity. But Stevens interpreted Freeman's composed reply as inappropriate familiarity rather than professional courtesy. In Stevens' worldview, black men who didn't demonstrate obvious deference to white authority were exhibiting attitude that required correction through assertion of rank and position. "Major," Stevens repeated with obvious skepticism, "I know all the officers stationed at this base, and I don't recognize you. What unit are you with?" His challenge was designed to expose what he assumed was Freeman's attempt to access facilities above his appropriate level. Stevens was confident that Freeman was either enlisted personnel trying to use officer facilities or a civilian contractor who had misunderstood access protocols. Freeman maintained his calm demeanor while recognizing that Stevens' behavior revealed exactly the institutional racism that division leadership had identified as Fort Harrison's central problem. "I'm new to Fort Harrison," Freeman replied simply, offering opportunity for Stevens to welcome a new colleague rather than escalate what should have been routine introduction. Several other officers had begun watching the interaction, their expressions showing mixture of curiosity and discomfort as Stevens' questioning became increasingly aggressive and inappropriate for addressing someone who might be a fellow officer. Specialist Carlos Mendez, a young soldier serving tables in the dining room, slowed his work to observe what appeared to be developing confrontation between a major and someone he assumed was being treated unfairly based on racial assumptions. Stevens' voice rose enough to be heard throughout the dining room. "Look, I don't know what your story is, but this is the Officers Club. If you're looking for the enlisted dining facility, it's in Building 47. If you're here for kitchen duty or maintenance work, you need to check in with the duty sergeant." His suggestion that Freeman was either lost enlisted personnel or service worker revealed the automatic assumptions that Stevens made about black men on military installations. They couldn't possibly be officers with legitimate access to command facilities. Freeman's military training allowed him to recognize Stevens' psychological profile immediately, an insecure individual using institutional racism to compensate for professional inadequacies, threatened by any challenge to racial hierarchies that protected his mediocrity from exposure. "Major Stevens," Freeman said calmly, reading the name tape on the officer's uniform, "I appreciate your attention to access protocols. However, I'm here on official business and have every right to use these facilities." The direct use of Stevens' name should have prompted the major to ask for Freeman's identity and unit assignment through proper military courtesy rather than continue making assumptions based on race. Instead, Stevens' hostility increased. "Official business? What official business does someone like you have in the Officers Club? Unless you're here to serve food or clean tables, I suggest you find your way to wherever you actually belong." The phrase "someone like you" made Stevens' racial motivation explicit, while his suggestion about service work revealed assumptions that black men on military bases were inherently subordinate regardless of their actual rank or position. Specialist Mendez, still observing from across the room, began discreetly recording with his cell phone, understanding that documenting the interaction might be crucial for protecting someone who was clearly being discriminated against by a superior officer. Freeman realized he was witnessing exactly the institutional racism that his command authority had been designed to eliminate, and that Stevens' behavior provided perfect opportunity to establish new leadership standards through immediate accountability rather than gradual education. The officers' club dining room had grown noticeably quieter as Major Stevens' confrontation with Freeman drew the attention of surrounding tables. What had begun as routine social interaction was evolving into a public display of institutional racism that would define how Fort Harrison's officer corps understood acceptable behavior under new leadership. Stevens, emboldened by what he perceived as Freeman's lack of response to his authority, decided to escalate the encounter by involving other officers as witnesses to his successful handling of what he characterized as an access violation. "Gentlemen," Stevens announced to his table mates, his voice carrying across the dining room, "we have a situation here that demonstrates exactly what I was discussing about maintaining proper standards and ensuring people understand their appropriate place in military hierarchy." Major Brad Hutchins, Stevens' longtime colleague and ideological ally, approached to provide support that demonstrated how institutional racism operated through group dynamics rather than individual prejudice alone. "Derek's right," Hutchins added, looking directly at Freeman with condescending authority. "Security protocols exist for important reasons. If you're not supposed to be here, the appropriate response is acknowledging the mistake and finding your correct location rather than arguing with superior officers." The characterization of Freeman's calm responses as arguing revealed how Stevens and his allies interpreted any black assertion of rights as inappropriate challenge to white authority that required group intervention to suppress. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Palmer, who had been dining at a nearby table and observing the interaction with growing alarm, recognized that she was witnessing exactly the toxic leadership that Freeman's appointment was intended to address. Palmer approached the confrontation with professional concern. "Major Stevens, is there a problem here that requires assistance?" Her intervention should have prompted Stevens to explain the situation professionally and seek appropriate resolution through proper channels. Instead, Stevens interpreted Palmer's question as validation of his authority and support for his actions. "Ma'am, I'm handling an access violation by someone who doesn't appear to understand appropriate facilities usage," Stevens replied, his tone suggesting he was performing valuable security function rather than engaging in racial harassment. Palmer's expression showed recognition that Stevens was creating exactly the type of incident that damaged unit cohesion and violated Army equal opportunity policies. But protocol required her to gather information before challenging a peer officer's actions publicly. Freeman remained seated throughout the escalating confrontation, his composed demeanor contrasting sharply with Stevens' aggressive posturing. His military experience had taught him that maintaining dignity under pressure often revealed more about character than responding to provocation with equal aggression. "Major Stevens," Freeman said quietly, "I believe you're making assumptions that aren't supported by facts. Perhaps we should resolve this through appropriate channels rather than creating a public spectacle that reflects poorly on your professionalism and judgment." His suggestion that Stevens was behaving unprofessionally triggered the Major's anger completely. In Stevens' worldview, black men who offered advice to white officers were demonstrating exactly the kind of uppity behavior that required harsh correction to maintain proper racial hierarchy. "Are you seriously trying to lecture me about professionalism?" Stevens replied, his voice rising to a level that commanded attention throughout the dining room. "You come into our officers' club without proper authorization, refuse to leave when directed, and now you're going to tell me how to do my job?" The possessive language, "our officers' club," revealed Stevens' view that military facilities belonged to white officers who had discretionary authority to exclude others based on racial assumptions rather than actual eligibility. Specialist Mendez, still recording from his position near the kitchen, had captured the entire exchange and recognized that he was documenting systematic discrimination that contradicted everything the Army claimed to stand for regarding equal treatment and professional respect. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base adjutant who had been briefed on Freeman's impending arrival but hadn't been told his exact timeline, entered the officers' club for dinner and immediately recognized the escalating situation as potentially explosive for command climate and public relations. Walsh approached Palmer with quiet urgency. "Ma'am, what's the situation here? This appears to be getting out of hand." Palmer's response was carefully measured. "Major Stevens is questioning this gentleman's right to use officer facilities. The situation requires command attention to ensure proper resolution." Her diplomatic phrasing avoided taking sides, while signaling that Stevens' behavior was inappropriate and potentially problematic for unit leadership. Freeman checked his watch and made a tactical decision that his preliminary assessment had gathered sufficient information about institutional culture and that Stevens' behavior provided perfect opportunity for establishing new command standards through dramatic accountability. Standing slowly from his table, Freeman's posture shifted subtly from civilian casualness to military bearing that suggested authority and command presence that made several observing officers unconsciously straighten their own posture in response. "Major Stevens," Freeman said in a voice that carried clearly throughout the dining room, "you've demonstrated exactly the leadership failures and institutional racism that my appointment to this command was designed to address. Your assumptions about who belongs in military facilities, your treatment of someone you perceived as subordinate, and your public display of discriminatory behavior have provided excellent case study for the cultural transformation this base requires." Stevens' expression showed dawning confusion as Freeman's tone and bearing suggested authority that contradicted the major's assumptions about racial hierarchy and military rank structure. The dining room had fallen completely silent as officers throughout the facility recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a confrontation that would either result in spectacular disciplinary action against someone who had challenged apparent authority or dramatic reversal that would reshape their understanding of leadership and accountability at Fort Harrison. While Major Stevens continued his public humiliation of Colonel Freeman in the Officers Club, his actions were being documented and reported through multiple channels that would converge with devastating consequences for his career and credibility within the Fort Harrison command structure. Specialist Carlos Mendez had been recording the confrontation while simultaneously sending secure messages to Command Sergeant Major Robert Diaz, whose responsibility for maintaining good order and discipline included monitoring officer behavior that affected unit morale and command climate. "CSM, you need to see what's happening in the O Club," Mendez texted along with video clips. "Major Stevens is racially profiling someone and making a huge scene. This is exactly the toxic leadership stuff that's been hurting our unit." Diaz, a 30-year veteran who had served with distinction across multiple deployments, immediately recognized the situation as potentially catastrophic for Fort Harrison's reputation and mission effectiveness. His experience with institutional racism had taught him that such incidents required immediate senior leadership attention to prevent escalation and demonstrate command commitment to equal treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, meanwhile, had discreetly contacted Captain Walsh through secure communication, understanding that the adjutant's role in coordinating base operations made her essential for managing what appeared to be developing into a significant command incident. "Jenny, we have a situation in the Officers Club that may require immediate command attention," Palmer messaged. "Major Stevens is engaged in what appears to be discriminatory behavior towards someone I don't recognize. The confrontation is public and getting worse." Walsh's response was immediate. "Sarah, I think I know who Stevens is confronting. The timing and description match our new CO's planned arrival. This could be catastrophic if Stevens is doing what I think he's doing." The realization that Stevens might be harassing the incoming base commander created urgent need for damage control and accountability that extended far beyond typical disciplinary measures for inappropriate officer behavior. At division headquarters, Brigadier General Hayes was reviewing operational reports when his aide delivered a priority message from Fort Harrison describing a developing situation involving potential discrimination against senior leadership during transition period. Hayes' immediate concern was operational security and command effectiveness. If Freeman was experiencing harassment during his first day at Fort Harrison, it suggested institutional problems were even worse than intelligence assessments had indicated. "Give me a direct line to Fort Harrison Command," Hayes ordered. If someone is interfering with Colonel Freeman's transition, that's not just discrimination, it's insubordination that threatens mission readiness and command authority. Major Linda Zhou, the base intelligence officer who had been briefed on Freeman's assessment methodology, had been monitoring communications and officer movements as part of security protocols for leadership transitions. Her position gave her access to information that revealed the full scope of what was developing. "Command, we have a situation that extends beyond individual misconduct," Zhou reported to the Operations Center. "Major Stevens has been conducting what appears to be racial harassment of Colonel Freeman while multiple officers observe. The incident is being recorded and will likely become public. We need immediate intervention to control narrative and demonstrate command accountability." The intelligence assessment made clear that Stevens' actions had created public relations crisis that could damage Army reputation and Fort Harrison's operational effectiveness if not handled decisively and transparently. Back in the officers' club, other officers who had been observing the confrontation were beginning to recognize that something significant was happening beyond routine personality conflict or access dispute. Major Susan Wright, the public affairs officer, had entered the dining room during the escalation and immediately understood that she was witnessing potential media crisis if Stevens' behavior toward Freeman became public knowledge. Wright began discreetly documenting the incident for damage control purposes, understanding that military public affairs required getting ahead of negative stories rather than reacting defensively after problems became public. Captain Timothy Grant, the base JAG officer, had been contacted by Palmer about potential legal implications of Stevens' behavior and was reviewing relevant regulations about discrimination, harassment, and command climate that would govern any formal investigation or disciplinary action. "Ma'am, if Stevens is engaging in racial harassment of any service member, that's violation of multiple UCMJ articles and Army regulations," Grant informed Palmer. "If the target is actually senior leadership, it becomes insubordination and conduct unbecoming that could result in court-martial." The legal analysis confirmed that Stevens' actions carried serious professional and legal consequences regardless of Freeman's identity, but especially if his assumptions about racial hierarchy had led him to harass his own commanding officer. Ms. Beverly Rodriguez, the equal opportunity advisor who had been documenting patterns of discriminatory behavior at Fort Harrison for her upcoming report to division leadership, received multiple notifications about the officers' club incident from personnel who recognized its significance for her ongoing assessment. "This is exactly the institutional racism I've been documenting," Rodriguez noted in her preliminary incident report. "Major Stevens feels comfortable engaging in public racial harassment because he assumes his actions will be protected by command structure that has historically enabled such behavior." Her professional assessment would become crucial for understanding how individual incidents of discrimination reflected broader institutional failures that required systematic reform rather than isolated punishment. As multiple reporting channels documented Stevens' misconduct and senior leadership prepared to respond, the major continued his harassment of Freeman with complete confidence that his actions were appropriate and would be supported by command structure that had protected similar behavior for years. He had no idea that within minutes, his assumptions about racial hierarchy and institutional protection would collide with the reality that he was publicly humiliating his new commanding officer in front of witnesses who were documenting every word for accountability purposes. Colonel Freeman stood at his table in the officers' club, his military bearing becoming unmistakable as he transitioned from civilian casualness to command presence that immediately altered the atmospheric dynamics throughout the dining room. His 22 years of leadership experience had taught him that decisive moments required clear demonstration of authority rather than gradual revelation of rank. Major Stevens, still confident in his racial assumptions and institutional protection, interpreted Freeman's authoritative posture as inappropriate challenge that required escalated response to maintain what he perceived as proper hierarchical order. "I don't know who you think you are," Stevens declared loudly enough for every officer in the facility to hear, "but this attitude is exactly what I was talking about regarding respect for authority and knowing your place in military structure." His language choice, knowing your place, made explicit the racial hierarchy that he believed governed military relationships regardless of actual rank or competence. Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, recognizing that the situation had reached critical mass requiring immediate intervention, approached Freeman with professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with Stevens' aggressive confrontation. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, the executive officer. Is there anything I can assist you with?" she asked, her tone suggesting recognition of authority that Stevens had completely missed. Freeman's response was measured but carried unmistakable command authority. "Colonel Palmer, thank you. I was conducting preliminary assessment of base culture and leadership standards." Major Stevens has provided excellent case study for the institutional problems that require immediate attention. The use of Palmer's rank and Freeman's reference to assessment should have alerted Stevens that he was dealing with someone possessing significant authority, but his racial assumptions prevented him from processing information that contradicted his predetermined conclusions. "Assessment," Stevens scoffed. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I'm not falling for whatever scam you're running." Security. His call for security assistance demonstrated complete confidence that institutional protection would validate his actions and remove what he perceived as threat to proper military order. Command Sergeant Major Diaz entered the officers' club at that moment, having received Specialist Mendez's alerts about developing situation that required senior enlisted leadership attention. His presence commanded immediate respect from every officer present, including Stevens, who snapped to appropriate courtesy despite his agitation. "What's the situation here?" Diaz asked with authority that made clear he expected accurate reporting rather than self-serving narratives. Stevens, assuming Diaz would support his version of events, replied confidently, "Sergeant Major, I've been dealing with an access violation by someone who refuses to acknowledge proper authority and leave the officers' dining facility. The subject has been argumentative and disrespectful throughout my attempts to resolve this appropriately." Diaz looked directly at Freeman, and his expression immediately shifted to recognition and respect as he identified the incoming base commander despite the civilian clothing. "Sir," Diaz said, rendering appropriate courtesy to Freeman, while simultaneously making Stevens' error unmistakably clear to everyone present, "I apologize for this situation. Is there anything you need from me to resolve this matter?" The CSM's deferential address to Freeman as "Sir" sent shockwaves through the assembled officers who realized they had been witnessing a subordinate officer harassing someone of superior rank. Stevens' face showed dawning confusion as he processed Diaz's respectful treatment of someone he had been dismissing as inappropriate presence in officer facilities. Freeman's response was crisp and military. "Sergeant Major, thank you." Major Stevens has demonstrated exactly the leadership failures that division has identified as priority for institutional reform. Please ensure this incident is properly documented for command review. Captain Walsh entered the dining room carrying official folders and approached Freeman with professional courtesy that further confirmed his authority and status. "Colonel Freeman," Walsh announced formally, "your quarters are prepared and the change of command briefing materials are ready for your review." The use of Freeman's rank and reference to change of command made his identity unmistakably clear to every officer present, creating visible shock among those who had witnessed Stevens' harassment of their incoming commanding officer. Stevens stood frozen as the implications of his actions became clear. He had spent 20 minutes publicly humiliating his new base commander based on racial assumptions that had led him to create exactly the type of incident that would define his career and credibility. Major Hutchins, who had supported Stevens' harassment, attempted to distance himself from the situation, Sir, I want to clarify that I was simply trying to assist with what appeared to be a misunderstanding about facility access. Freeman's response was measured but definitive. Major Hutchins, there was no misunderstanding about facility access. There was racial profiling by officers who assumed that black men couldn't possibly hold positions of authority. Your assistance enabled discriminatory behavior rather than challenging it. The clear articulation of racial motivation eliminated any possibility of characterizing the incident as miscommunication or procedural confusion rather than institutional racism that required accountability. Freeman addressed the assembled officers with command authority that made his expectations unmistakably clear. Everyone here has witnessed exactly the toxic leadership and discriminatory behavior that my appointment was designed to address. Major Stevens' actions tonight provide perfect illustration of why this base requires comprehensive cultural transformation rather than gradual administrative adjustment. The room remained silent as officers processed that their new commander had observed their authentic behavior during what they thought was off-duty social interaction, and that his assessment would determine future leadership standards and career consequences for those who had participated in or enabled discrimination. The Fort Harrison Officers Club became the epicenter of a power reversal that would redefine military leadership standards and demonstrate how quickly institutional protection could transform into career-ending accountability when racist assumptions collided with actual chain of command authority. Major Derek Stevens, Colonel Freeman announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command throughout the now silent dining room. You have spent the past 20 minutes demonstrating exactly why Fort Harrison requires new leadership and comprehensive cultural reform. Stevens stood paralyzed as the full implications of his actions became clear. Every assumption he had made about racial hierarchy, every comment about knowing your place, and every attempt to remove Freeman from officer facilities had been directed at his new commanding officer. Sir, I had no way of knowing your identity, Stevens stammered, attempting damage control that revealed his complete failure to understand the gravity of what he had done. If I had known you were Colonel Freeman, I would never have. Freeman interrupted with precision that eliminated any excuse. Major Stevens, the problem isn't that you failed to recognize my rank. The problem is that you assumed a black man couldn't possibly be an officer worthy of respect and courtesy. Your behavior would have been equally inappropriate and discriminatory regardless of whether I was a private, sergeant, lieutenant, or colonel. The distinction between failing to recognize authority and systematically assuming racial inferiority made Stevens' actions indefensible under any military standard or human decency principle. Lieutenant Colonel Palmer stepped forward to address the institutional implications. Sir, Major Stevens' behavior tonight reflects broader cultural problems that several of us have been documenting. This incident demonstrates systematic rather than isolated failures in leadership and equal opportunity compliance. Her assessment transformed Stevens' individual misconduct into evidence of institutional racism that required comprehensive reform rather than simple disciplinary action against one officer. Command Sergeant Major Diaz provided enlisted perspective that carried significant weight in military culture. Colonel Freeman, I've served with soldiers of every rank and background for 30 years. What Major Stevens demonstrated tonight is exactly the toxic leadership that destroys unit cohesion and mission effectiveness. His assumptions about who deserves respect based on race rather than character are incompatible with Army values. The CSM's testimony provided professional validation that Stevens' behavior violated fundamental military principles rather than just personal sensitivity or political correctness. Specialist Mendez approached the group with his recording device, his courage in documenting misconduct demonstrating exactly the kind of integrity that effective military culture required from personnel at every level. Sir, I recorded the entire incident because I knew what Major Stevens was doing was wrong, Mendez told Freeman. Soldiers talk about this kind of discrimination all the time, but usually nobody with authority witnesses it. Tonight, everyone saw exactly how some officers really think about race and respect. His testimony from an enlisted perspective provided crucial evidence that Stevens' behavior reflected attitudes that were visible throughout the command structure rather than hidden individual prejudice. Major Susan Wright, recognizing her public affairs responsibilities, approached Freeman with professional concern about institutional reputation and media management. "Sir, this incident will likely become public knowledge. How do you want to handle communications about command standards and accountability measures?" Freeman's response demonstrated strategic thinking about using the crisis as opportunity for positive change. "Major Wright, we will be completely transparent about what happened tonight and how we're addressing institutional racism. Cover-ups and denial protect bad actors while failing victims. Accountability and reform protect the Army's integrity." Captain Timothy Grant, the JAG officer, provided legal framework for Freeman's authority to address the misconduct. "Sir, Major Stevens' actions tonight constitute violations of multiple UCMJ articles. Conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to treat subordinates with dignity and respect, and creating hostile environment based on race. His behavior toward you specifically adds insubordination and disrespect toward superior commissioned officer." The legal analysis confirmed that Stevens faced serious professional consequences regardless of any personal forgiveness or institutional desire to minimize the incident's impact. Stevens made one final attempt to minimize his culpability. "Colonel Freeman, I want to emphasize that my actions were based on security concerns rather than racial bias. If my questioning seemed excessive, that reflects dedication to proper protocols rather than discriminatory intent." Freeman's response eliminated any possibility of hiding behind procedural justifications. "Major Stevens, your own words tonight included telling me to find where people like me belong, suggesting I was here for kitchen duty, and lecturing other officers about maintaining standards regarding facility access. Those statements reveal racial assumptions that no security protocol justifies or explains." The direct quotation of Stevens' discriminatory language made denial impossible and demonstrated that his actions were motivated by racism rather than legitimate military concerns. Major Hutchins, realizing his own complicity in enabling Stevens' harassment, attempted to minimize his role. "Sir, I was trying to support what I thought was appropriate security enforcement. If Major Stevens was engaging in discrimination, I didn't recognize the signs and should have intervened." Freeman addressed the broader complicity that enabled individual racism. Major Hutchins, discrimination operates through group dynamics where bystanders enable misconduct through silence or support. Your failure to challenge obviously inappropriate behavior made you participant rather than witness. That complicity is exactly what allows institutional racism to flourish. Colonel Freeman addressed the assembled officers with expectations that would define his command philosophy. "Everyone here has witnessed systematic discrimination and the institutional protection that enables it. Major Stevens' actions tonight represent everything that will change under my leadership. Officers who demonstrate competence and character will advance regardless of their background. Officers who rely on racism and toxic behavior will face accountability regardless of their seniority or connections." As military police arrived to escort Stevens for formal processing, the transformation was complete. The major who had assumed racial hierarchy protected his authority now faced career-ending consequences under the command of someone whose competence and character had earned legitimate leadership through merit rather than prejudice. The procedural reforms created institutional safeguards that would make discrimination difficult to hide and costly to perpetrate rather than relying on individual officers' willingness to report misconduct that might damage their careers. Dr. Michael Foster, the base chaplain, addressed the moral dimensions of institutional change. Military service requires integrity that extends beyond following orders to actively protecting the dignity of every person under our command. Major Stevens' behavior violated not just regulations, but fundamental principles about human worth that make military service honorable rather than merely functional. The spiritual perspective provided ethical framework that complemented legal and procedural reforms, emphasizing that institutional change required moral commitment rather than just compliance with new policies. Freeman concluded the assembly with expectations that would define his command philosophy. Fort Harrison will become a model installation where merit determines advancement, character governs behavior, and every soldier receives respect regardless of their background. Those who demonstrate competence and integrity will thrive. Those who rely on discrimination and toxic leadership will face accountability that ends their military careers. Major Stevens was subsequently court-martialed and sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 6 months confinement. The harsh sentence established precedent that racial harassment of fellow service members, especially superior officers, constituted serious military crimes worthy of career-ending punishment. Major Stevens' actions demonstrated complete failure of character and judgment that make him unfit for military service, the court-martial judge stated. His racist assumptions and public harassment of his commanding officer violated every principle that military leadership requires. The legal consequences sent clear messages throughout Army that discriminatory behavior would trigger severe professional and personal costs that made racism professionally self-destructive. Major Hutchins faced administrative separation for failing to challenge obvious misconduct, his career ending through failure to meet professional standards rather than criminal charges, but still resulting in loss of military status and benefits. The accountability meeting concluded with structural changes that would be monitored by division leadership, federal oversight for 2 years, quarterly equal opportunity audits, revised promotion criteria that weighted leadership character equally with technical competence, and anonymous reporting systems that protected whistleblowers from retaliation. General Hayes announced that Freeman's handling of the discrimination incident would become case study taught at Command and General Staff College. Colonel Freeman demonstrated exactly how military leaders should respond to institutional racism through immediate accountability, transparent communication, and systematic reform that addresses root causes rather than just individual symptoms. As the assembly concluded, soldiers throughout Fort Harrison approached Freeman to express gratitude for exposing problems they had experienced but felt powerless to address through normal command channels. "Sir, thank you for showing that the Army really does care about treating everyone fairly," one young soldier told him. "We knew Major Stevens was wrong, but nobody with authority seemed to listen until now." Freeman's response emphasized collective responsibility. Change happens because soldiers like Specialist Mendez have courage to document wrongdoing, and leaders like Sergeant Major Diaz create environments where integrity matters more than convenience. My job is using command authority to act on what good soldiers already know is right. Over the following 12 weeks, Fort Harrison underwent the most comprehensive transformation in its institutional history, implementing changes that would serve as Army-wide model for eliminating discriminatory leadership while maintaining operational effectiveness and unit cohesion. The Leadership Excellence Center, established under Colonel Freeman's direct authority, was directed by Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, whose experience with institutional reform and commitment to inclusive leadership made her ideal for rebuilding Fort Harrison's command culture from foundation principles upward. "We're not just removing bad leaders," Palmer explained during mandatory training attended by all 847 officers and senior NCOs. "We're building leadership systems that reward competence and character while making discrimination organizationally impossible to sustain. Every promotion, assignment, and evaluation will reflect Army values rather than personal prejudices." The training emphasized practical application rather than theoretical sensitivity, using case studies from Stevens' misconduct to demonstrate how bias undermined mission effectiveness and created legal liability that threatened unit operations and individual careers. Command Sergeant Major Diaz implemented revolutionary accountability measures throughout the enlisted ranks. Every NCO's leadership effectiveness was now tracked through subordinate feedback, retention rates, and unit cohesion metrics that made discriminatory leadership visible through data analysis rather than relying solely on formal complaints. Leadership isn't about controlling soldiers through fear or prejudice, Diaz explained to NCO development courses. It's about building teams where everyone contributes their best regardless of background. Data shows that inclusive units perform better in every measurable category: retention, readiness, morale, and mission success. The statistical approach eliminated subjective arguments about leadership effectiveness, making clear that discriminatory practices produced measurably worse outcomes than inclusive leadership across all military functions. Colonel Freeman worked with Pentagon diversity officers to develop the Fort Harrison Protocol, comprehensive procedures for identifying and addressing institutional racism in military settings before it escalated to crisis levels that damaged unit effectiveness and Army reputation. Military effectiveness requires trust between leaders and subordinates, Freeman explained during his briefing to Army senior leadership. Discrimination destroys that trust and creates environments where soldiers focus on protecting themselves from abuse rather than accomplishing missions. Constitutional leadership isn't political correctness, it's operational necessity. His framework elevated equal opportunity from administrative requirement to strategic military capability essential for maintaining effective fighting forces. The Equal Opportunity Commission, established with authority independent of normal command structure, included soldier representatives, community leaders, military law experts, and retired senior leaders with power to investigate complaints, review personnel actions, and recommend policy changes, including removal of discriminatory leaders. Specialist Mendez, promoted to sergeant and assigned as enlisted representative, provided crucial perspective about how discrimination affected junior personnel who typically lacked voice in institutional decision-making. Soldiers know which leaders are fair and which ones play favorites based on race or personal relationships, Mendez told the commission during its first quarterly review. When we have official ways to report problems and know that good leaders will protect us from retaliation, it changes everything about unit culture. The enlisted voice in oversight ensured that reforms addressed actual problems rather than officer assumptions about what soldiers needed for effective leadership and career development. Ms. Rodriguez's expanded Equal Opportunity Office received federal funding to provide discrimination response training throughout Army installations, using Fort Harrison's transformation as proof that institutional racism could be eliminated through sustained leadership commitment and systematic accountability. Leadership change requires both removing discriminatory officers and promoting leaders who demonstrate inclusive competence, Rodriguez explained during inter-service training conferences. You can't just prohibit bad behavior. You have to reward good behavior and create advancement opportunities for leaders who build effective, diverse teams. Stevens' dismissal had triggered review of his entire career, revealing pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been overlooked or rationalized by previous leadership. 17 soldiers who had been adversely affected by his actions received corrective personnel actions, including restored promotion opportunities and removal of negative evaluations that reflected bias rather than performance. Major Wright's Public Affairs Office documented the transformation process for Army-wide distribution, creating training materials that helped other installations implement similar reforms without requiring crisis-level incidents to motivate change. Fort Harrison proves that military units can eliminate discrimination while improving rather than hindering operational effectiveness, Wright reported to Army Public Affairs. Constitutional leadership creates stronger units, better soldiers, and more successful missions. The documentation provided roadmap for institutional change that could be implemented proactively rather than reactively, preventing discrimination rather than just responding to it after damage occurred. Data analysis 10 months into reforms showed remarkable improvements. Discrimination complaints decreased by 89%, while soldier satisfaction increased across all demographic categories. Retention rates improved significantly, particularly among minority personnel who had previously left military service due to hostile leadership environments. Unit readiness scores increased as soldiers focused on mission accomplishment rather than navigating discriminatory leadership, while officer efficiency reports showed improved performance as leaders learned to evaluate subordinates based on competence rather than personal biases. Eliminating discrimination didn't weaken military standards, Freeman acknowledged during congressional testimony about Army equal opportunity progress. It strengthened them by ensuring advancement and recognition reflected actual merit rather than irrelevant personal characteristics. 12 months after Major Stevens' career-ending display of racism, Colonel Freeman hosted Fort Harrison's first annual Leadership Excellence and Equal Opportunity Day, a celebration of the comprehensive reforms that had transformed the installation from a place where discrimination was tolerated into a model of inclusive military leadership. The transformation was evident throughout the base. Barracks that had previously been segregated informally through discriminatory assignments now housed integrated units where soldiers built relationships across racial and cultural lines. Training areas that had once echoed with discriminatory language now featured mentorship programs where experienced soldiers developed junior personnel based on potential rather than prejudice. Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, promoted to deputy commander for her exceptional leadership during the institutional transformation, greeted Freeman with visible pride in what had been accomplished under his command. "Sir, I want to show you what constitutional military leadership looks like when it's embedded in every aspect of operations," Palmer said, displaying comprehensive metrics that demonstrated Fort Harrison's evolution into one of Army's highest-performing installations. The data showed complete elimination of demographic disparities in promotions, assignments, and disciplinary actions, while overall unit performance had improved across every measurable category from readiness to retention to mission success. When leadership operates on merit rather than bias, every metric improves, Palmer explained. Soldiers perform better when they trust their leaders. Leaders make better decisions when they evaluate people accurately. And units accomplish more when everyone contributes their best capabilities. Sergeant Mendez, now a staff sergeant and the installation's first enlisted equal opportunity representative, had not only advanced rapidly through merit-based promotion, but had become a powerful advocate for institutional accountability throughout Army. "Colonel Freeman, I want you to see something," Mendez said, leading Freeman to a display case containing Stevens' original discriminatory statements alongside the comprehensive reforms they had triggered. "We keep this as a reminder that individual racism can destroy units and careers," Mendez explained to visiting personnel from other installations. "But we also keep it to show that accountability and reform are stronger than discrimination when leaders have courage to enforce standards and soldiers have integrity to demand justice." His perspective on institutional change reflected how personal experience with discrimination had been transformed into systematic understanding of how to prevent similar problems. Command Sergeant Major Diaz, whose immediate support during the Officers Club incident had been crucial for Freeman's authority, now served as Army-wide consultant for NCO leadership development that emphasized inclusive excellence over traditional hierarchies. Stevens' racism taught us that discrimination isn't just wrong morally, it's wrong tactically, Diaz told leadership conferences attended by thousands of military personnel. Units that waste talent through bias can't compete with units that develop everyone's capabilities. Inclusive leadership isn't social engineering, it's military effectiveness. Ms. Rodriguez had been promoted to Army headquarters as Director of Institutional Equal Opportunity, using Fort Harrison's transformation as template for service-wide reforms that would protect military families from discriminatory leadership while maintaining operational standards. The Federal Military Equal Opportunity Office had expanded Fort Harrison's protocols to over 100 installations worldwide, demonstrating that inclusive leadership principles were universally applicable rather than situation-specific accommodations. General Hayes, promoted to 3-star rank partly based on his support for Freeman's transformative leadership, visited Fort Harrison to assess long-term sustainability of the cultural changes. This installation proves that military excellence and equal opportunity aren't competing values, Hayes observed during his inspection. They're complementary capabilities that create stronger units, better leaders, and more effective fighting forces. Major Derek Stevens, meanwhile, had been unable to find employment in any capacity requiring leadership or authority after his military dismissal. His conviction for discriminatory conduct had created permanent record that made him unemployable in government, corporate, or nonprofit sectors that required character evaluation. His complete professional destruction served as powerful deterrent for other officers who might consider whether racist behavior was worth the risk, demonstrating that discrimination carried consequences extending far beyond military careers. On Freeman's final evening as Fort Harrison commander before his promotion to brigadier general and new assignment, he met with soldiers whose courage during the Officers Club incident had made accountability possible. "You proved that individual integrity can trigger institutional change when people have courage to challenge wrong behavior and leaders have wisdom to support right action," Freeman told them during an informal gathering. Staff Sergeant Mendez spoke for the group. "Sir, you showed us that rank and authority should serve justice rather than protect injustice. That lesson will stay with us throughout our careers and make us better leaders." As Freeman prepared for his new assignment, he carried evidence that American military institutions could evolve beyond their historical failures when leadership prioritized constitutional principles over institutional comfort. Fort Harrison now stood as proof that discrimination could be eliminated without compromising military effectiveness, that accountability enhanced rather than hindered unit performance, and that inclusive leadership created stronger fighting forces than traditional hierarchies based on prejudice rather than merit. Most importantly, the installation demonstrated that transformation required both removing individual bad actors and building systems that prevented discrimination, rewarded inclusive excellence, and maintained standards that served military effectiveness rather than personal bias. The colonel, who had been dismissed as someone who didn't belong, now left behind an institution where belonging was determined by character and competence rather than race or connections, where leadership was earned through merit rather than inherited through prejudice, and where Army values meant constitutional protection for all rather than privilege for some. That transformation, from institutional racism to inclusive excellence, from toxic leadership to merit-based command, from discriminatory assumptions to constitutional respect, represented the kind of systematic change that made military service honorable and effective rather than merely hierarchical and traditional. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.